Homage to the Triple Gem. So hope that everybody's keeping well wherever it might be. And I've come back down here to Bhattaramula for a short time and just taking some treatment and then off to second Vasa, hopefully. And so was asked a question not long ago about basically ultimate reality. So what the person said, and just paraphrasing here, was that ultimate reality is the citta, and the citta is made up of these different elements. And so then they said, if somebody wants to see that paramatta, the ultimate reality, what do you think? Do you think it exists? So this was what they asked. So one of the things with the Buddha's teachings is that the Buddha actually taught that there's certain questions that should be put aside. So certain questions that are worth asking and certain questions that should be put aside. So the kinds of questions that are worth asking is like, where does the suffering come from, and how do I put a stop to the suffering that's arisen? Sometimes you have to ask where it's coming from. The kind of questions that are not worth asking is the world finite? Is it infinite? Does the Tathagata exist after death? Does he not exist after death? In the centuries after the Buddha passed away, I've mentioned this in a bunch of different talks, there was a trend in Buddhism to speculate about what actually existed outside and how the world was constructed. And there was a lot of pretty refined philosophical debates going on about this. A lot of these questions and the answers that they came up with were codified into various what they call abhidhammas in the earliest phase. Later it mushroomed out into more things. But the abhidhamma was in the earliest phase. And a lot of the questions that are considered to be ultimate reality, or this profound revelation about what reality is, these actually mostly can come under these questions like, is the world finite or is it infinite? They're questions about the ultimate nature of the world outside. These kind of questions, the Buddha says, leads to a thicket of views or a wilderness of views. These kind of speculations, asking these kind of questions, just leads onwards to more and more views, and one does not become freed from suffering because of it. And actually, in researching a talk that I did in Australia, I kind of found that Buddhism in India just kind of proliferated quite a bit, more and more and more actually. Until even as a monk, reading some of these treaties, it's hard for me to follow what's going on here and what does it have to do with practice. So the Abhidhamma was the first step in that process. And whether or not an ultimate reality exists or what ultimate reality is like is kind of a moot point. Actually, the Buddha makes some very cryptic phrases from time to time, like that you should think that basically one should think all this is unreal, or like the world is an illusion. And it's he speaks in praise of thinking this way from time to time, but doesn't necessarily classify that as an ultimate reality. And one has to go back and trace what it's attached to when the Buddha says that. Whenever the Buddha talks in the suttas, it's basically always something that is pointing back at the way that we create the world through our six senses, and the suffering that we cause through the way that we attach to the world, through the way that we crave for it. So questions about what's ultimately real or not are in a completely different category from this line of questioning. And just jumping on to this point about what's ultimately real or ultimately not real. Actually, even in quantum physics, they have at least one popular theory about quantum physics. There's different theories relating to quantum physics, but the earliest one that as a layman, I could understand was one of the earlier ones that I could understand as a layman, not as a physicist, obviously, was that there's this principle called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and correct me if I'm wrong, if there's any physicists watching the video, but that basically this principle states that at the very smallest levels of reality for particles, if you measure for a wave, then you get a wave. If you measure for a particle, you get a particle. And there's always an uncertainty in that you can't know both the trajectory and the position of the particle, something like this. So you can never basically map out. You can never know fully at the smallest level of reality. You can't predict. You can't say a particle's position, its velocity, and its direction, where it's going, and say it's going to end up there. There's always a certain amount of uncertainty, and the more that you measure, when you measure one, the others become more uncertain. So, in a certain sense, what this means in the very smallest levels of particles in quantum physics is that, to a certain extent, in this particular theory, this way of looking at it, is that what we look for shapes the reality that we perceive. So, in other words, if we think that the world is made up of chaitasikas and, it's made up of, these very minute building blocks that are enumerated in the Abhidhamma, and we think that the goal of our meditation is to see this or to gain an insight into this, and then seeing this, that somehow this will release us from craving. So if we look for that in this schema, like in this particular way of interpreting quantum physics, if we look for that, we may find it. We may create it by looking for it. So it can be in this way that the Buddha said it's good to regard the world as an illusion. But one regards the world as an illusion in the sense that it's not worth hanging on to. Not in the sense that we're going to realize that the world, one is going to have some experience of ultimate reality and somehow know like all the components and building blocks and the functioning of the universe as a result or as a necessary step in letting go of one's defilements. Actually, one doesn't let go of the things that cause one to suffer because one is addicted to them, because one craves after them. One is addicted to them. So whether one knows that these things are permanent or impermanent, or they're made up of 20 or 30 or 40 chaitasikas, or whatever one thinks they're ultimately made up of, the fact is that one likes them, one is addicted to them, and one can't let them go, even though grabbing onto them causes one to suffer. So the most important points about reality to know, or some of the most important points, is that whatever a person grabs onto in the end will cause them to suffer. Whatever it is that the person craves after will cause them to suffer. But in letting go of this craving, one has to let go of it stepwise, in the same way that one lets go of an addiction. So it's a training of the mind. So the questions that are fruitful to ask are not necessarily like, does this ultimate reality exist? Or how does one see the ultimate truth? Which sounds very profound, or whatever it might be. What one wants to see is the next step forward, is the way in which one can eliminate the defilements that are in one's mind that are causing one to suffer. And that sounds a lot more mundane, but experientially it's much more profound for a person who practices it than gaining some kind of knowledge of how many chaitasikas or whatever it is that the door, the bed, or the ultimate reality is made up of, which is not something all that amazing. Because whatever one knows about ultimate reality, so long as one craves for it, one will still suffer. One's experience of that reality will be colored, will be tainted by whatever it is that whatever perceptions one has about it, whatever cravings one has about it. And this is what the Buddha means when he says in the I think it's called the Rohitassa Sutta, that the world is in this fathom-long body. In other words, the most important thing to know is the way that we construct the world through our cravings, our desires, our perceptions, and how this causes us to suffer, because that's something we can control. And if we practice to put an end to this, this is much more profound knowledge than the knowledge of how many atoms or whatever it is that might be the bed or the chair might be made up of. The most profound knowledge that a person can gain is the knowledge that their defilements have come to an end. And this is the purpose for which the Buddha taught. The Buddha has said that he teaches only two things, suffering and the end of suffering. And all of his teaching can be basically fit under this. So when we ask questions that aim at this, we ask questions in the sense that, what is it that I'm doing to cause myself to suffer, and how to put a stop to it, and then actually try to put a stop to it. These are the best types of questions to ask. Whether the world is finite, whether it's infinite, these may be things that actually exist, but they're not that important. The most important thing is our suffering and how we can put it to an end. Okay, so leave that for reflection, and wishing everybody all the blessings of Dhamma practice.